Namotia. I direct the Center for Civil Society. I'm introducing Danford Chibongodze and Andries Motau, who facilitate this series. And I'm very, very thrilled to welcome Tana Joseph today. So Tana is a remarkable person. She is an astronomer, science communicator, entrepreneur, and obviously an advocate for decolonization. So she obtained her PhD in physics from the University of Southampton. She was based in Cape Town for a bit, where she began her research career, and her focus is the physics of binary stellar systems outside of our Milky Way Galaxy. So this makes the research that I focus on look incredibly simple. This is fascinating. I hope we get to hear a little bit more about what exactly that is and what it entails. So Tana became involved in science communication, and she's very interested in initiatives that encourage underserved communities, marginalized communities, voiceless communities to participate in science and in the sciences. And she has recently turned her attention towards decolonization efforts in the science academia in general, which is what she's going to be focusing on today. The topic of today's seminar is decolonizing the sciences. And I just want to say a couple of things about how this seminar series happened. We didn't plan to have a seminar series on decolonization, but we had a number of conversations around our Black Lives Matter seminar series. And obviously one of the conversations that were being had within those debates was decolonization, decolonizing not just our curricula and our university, decolonizing our minds, decolonizing our spaces, decoloniality in general. And there is another seminar series that's going to be upcoming that's spearheaded by Sajida Seda, who I think is here today, and she heads up the UKZN Decoloniality Group or Decoloniality Initiative. So that's going to be an amazing seminar series. So this seminar series is a more sort of casual way to just reflect on some of the debates that came up during the Black Lives Matter series. And we are very lucky to have been able to confirm some of the speakers that we have, and one of them is Tana. And I'm going to hand over now to Danford and Andries, who are facilitating. Tana, thanks so much for being here. So lovely to see you, and I hope we can have more conversations going forward, also about COVID-19.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Shona. Tana, we have met. I'm Andries Motau. I'm one of the researchers at the Center for Civil Society. Just simple house rules for everyone that are new to the webinar series. You have to remain muted and your cameras should be off. If there are any pressing issues that you want to raise, you can type them in the chat box, or alternatively, you raise your visual hand. We're going to give Tanya about 30 minutes to do her presentation, and then after we'll take questions. We'll take questions, but then we ultimately wish that there could be some sort of debate so that we can learn from each other. So Tanya, your 30 minutes starts now, and all the best.
Thank you for that introduction. Shona and Andries, thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. I will start sharing my screen. I think that's the best way to do it. Which of these talks is the one that I want? Yes, this one. So I'll just play from start. Is everyone able to, can I just get a few thumbs up or whatever to, everyone can see the slides that I'm sharing?
Yeah, that is good.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to be talking today about the decolonization efforts in South African astronomy, and what I'm saying here can be certainly extended to all of the sciences. And I will be sort of presenting a meta discussion of this decolonization process in South African science, in that this talk will be a talk that I've given to the South African astronomy research community. And so it'll look like I'm giving this talk to you as if you are the South African research astronomy community, but it's actually just to kind of take you through the steps of what we're facing, what we're trying to do, what the challenges are, etc. And also just to highlight, so this is a bit nerve-wracking for me. I'm a public speaker and a science communicator, but I rarely get the chance to talk to my colleagues in the social sciences. And as someone in the hard sciences, as someone who did physics, those kind of interactions, interdisciplinary interactions with the humanities, are even rarer. So just to give you some insight into what I'm going to say, to sort of hold in the back of your mind when you're hearing all these things I'm saying, is that this talk is considered radical in the science circles, and that is probably an indication of how social justice issues are perceived and handled in the sciences. So you might get through this talk and think, oh, this has been so milquetoast, this is just scratching the surface, she didn't even reference Fanon. But in my circles in the sciences, to show you how much work there needs to be done, this was a very radical talk. Heads of department were having staff meetings about this. It was something that, as they say on the internet, it shook the table. So just to give you a little bit of background, I am a South African astronomer, and I study black holes and neutron stars that have another star going around them. I did my undergrad and master's at Shona said at UCT. I went abroad for my PhD and then came back to South Africa, and I'm back abroad now. And so I have had a lot of experience with various outreach, with various what we call, what's now being called equity, diversity and inclusion, with transformation as it's evolved over the course of my studies and my career. But what I am not is an actual scholar of decolonization. I have a PhD in counting light particles. I point a telescope at the sky and then I count how many photons come from a star. And then that's what I do as my research career. So I am not on the same level as my humanities counterparts who write the papers and do the actual research on this. But at the moment, I am one of the few people willing to speak out about these issues in science, and it's very frustrating, but it needs to be said. So this is something that I start my talk with when I talk to my colleagues. I say, if we are committed to doing this decolonization work in South Africa, then we need to understand what these concepts mean. And we need to be prepared to have difficult conversations about ourselves and, about our workplace, etc., and our ethos. And this actually needs to be said. So everything that I have to do in these talks is sort of a step-by-step walking them through what is decolonization. The old textbook definition is, the process of becoming independent from a former colonial power. And now it's more to do with restorative justice through various freedoms, or working towards various freedoms, and how we use it in astronomy or in academia, or in science academia, I should say. I found this really nice definition that I like from someone, a student, an honor student, who turned this in for their dissertation last year. And they say that decolonization academia goes beyond racial redress, and it aims to connect the center of knowledge production with the society it produces this knowledge for. And that for me is kind of summed up in my definition, which is nothing about us without us, basically. It's not just about tearing down statues, which I think is also important, but acknowledging and centering and supporting African science for and by Africans. And so, of course, then the question is, how do you decolonize science? I know that this was brought up during the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall. There was like, they did try to get this thing about decolonizing science started. I wasn't where I am now in my learning and my journey and decolonizing my own mind and thought processes. And I, like a lot of people, kind of scoffed at this. We were confused as to how do you decolonize facts, because science is about finding facts, and you collect facts, you do this experiment, then you write it down, then you have facts, and it's about exposing the truth of the universe. But science is actually so much more than that. And Jonathan Marks, former scientist and now author, he gives a definition, a three-pronged definition of what science is. And he says it's a series of techniques, it is a community of people, and it is an information organization structure in conversation with power. And when you think of science like that, It's not just it's not just doing experiments, it's about the people who do the experiments, and who gets to do the experiments, and what happens with that information, what it's used for, all the kind of stuff. And as soon as you have also power involved, so you have people, you have power, and as we know as academics, there's also money in the mix. So that leads me to a fourth aspect that I think is incredibly important about science, that a lot of scientists and non-scientists don't want to grapple with, is that science is and always has been political. You can't have people and power and politics, even if you just have people and money, you must automatically have politics if you have even one of those three ingredients: the money, the people, and the power. There must be some kind of political agenda behind this. And as academics, we understand this because we know that you don't just become an academic and get to study whatever you want to do, whatever research you want. You have to apply for what funding is there. And the funding allocation is dependent on what's hot right now or prioritized by the government. And another thing that I have thought about for a long time, before I started any of this work, I've kind of put together in my mind that academia, and especially science academia, is still very largely based on 17th century European social constructs, because the Western scientific revolution, so the one that happened in Europe in the 17th century with people like Johannes Kepler, Galileo Galilei, the first person to look through telescope at the planets, Isaac Newton, who was one of the two people that invented calculus, etc. These were all rich, influential people. They had leisure to study, they had servants, or they had the right connections that could literally give them an audience with a king, and the king would sponsor their studies. And today's academic system, certainly in the sciences, is still set up basically for men who don't have to worry about money, for men, able-bodied men who have either servants or a wife to raise their children and bring them food and make sure that the house is kept up and all of that. So this is, when you think about it in terms of this community of people, and in terms of, in terms of who gets to do science, you start to realize where the decolonization needs to come in. And something that we like to talk about, especially in regards to women in science, they call it this leaky pipeline. Like, why are we losing all these women at various stages of the academic journey? And I hate that phrase, leaky pipeline, because it's a cute name for discrimination, basically. And I've had to say to my colleagues, the oppressive structures that exist in wider society are also at play in academia and in science academia, because scientists are very arrogant. We think that having a PhD in physics makes us qualified to do economics or to do epidemiology now. With this that we're modeling things and we're making predictions. Like, no, we are limited by what we've studied, and that's absolutely fine. Stay in your lane, and also understand that what's happening outside academia is also happening inside academia. Just because you're really smart and good at maths doesn't mean that you're not biased, or that you're not racist or sexist or ableist or homophobic, or whatever the case may be. Because scientists really think that they are way too rational to suffer from the biases that normal people suffer from. And so with all of this now sort of unpacked for my colleagues, I get to this point that starts to make people really uncomfortable, because I've come out and said that there's a colonial history of astronomy in South Africa, more so than any other science, in that South Africa's oldest research institution is the South African Astronomical Observatory, the SAAO, in Observatory in Cape Town. So for those of you who are familiar with the southern suburbs of Cape Town, there's that suburb called Observatory, and it's called Observatory because they built an observatory there. And it was built in 1820. So in fact, there's the 200-year celebration of SAAO is happening right now. There's a whole conference happening. I'm just not attending. And so this is a literal colonial institution, and it's South Africa's oldest research institution. So the first official research institution or Western research institution in South Africa was set up as part of a colonial venture, the British in South Africa. And then the University of Cape Town Astronomy Department is sort of that next stage of an oppressive regime in South Africa, which is apartheid. And this astronomy department is the only one in South Africa that is separate from the physics department, because astronomy is basically just a branch of physics, like nuclear physics or particle physics or material physics or whatever. But in the rest of the country, astronomy is a sub-department of the physics department. But at UCT, astronomy is its own separate department, and it was set up basically because there was this British astronomer who's still alive called Professor Brian Warner, and they wanted him to come to South Africa and science. And they offered him was a department. They said, if you leave the US, he's British, but he was working in the US at the time. If you leave the US to come work in South Africa and set up this department or this research group, we will give you your own department and you won't be beholden to physics. And since that time, so this happened in the 70s. So this was at the height of apartheid. The astronomy department was set up. And since that time, there has never been a South African head of department at the UCT astronomy department. All of the heads of department so far have been British and Dutch. And basically in that sense, it's a perfect microcosm of the colonial history of South Africa, the British and the Dutch, at war or fighting against each other or taking turns to rule South Africa. And so it is at the UCT astronomy department. And one thing I was also very open about saying, and I think that's probably ruffled feathers, is that I said, these people who are now senior academics and sit on funding committees and are, advisors to the government and all the stuff, these are often foreign white people who came from Europe during the height of apartheid, the 70s and 80s. They moved here to further their career, and they were happy to overlook a crime against humanity occurring against the vast majority of South Africans, and they didn't care. They left Europe or even the UK and they went to South Africa, and they're like, oh, no, apartheid will take me to South Africa and just ignore this horrible thing that's happening to most of the people. And they are the ones now in charge of transformation efforts or leading transformation efforts and drawing up policy and all this kind of stuff. And so my question to my community was, how can we trust these people? How can we trust these people who, a few decades ago were happy to overlook a crime against humanity to further their career, and now we're supposed to entrust them with our transformation programs? And so sort of stepping away from the old guard of astronomy institutions, there's this new thing, the Square Kilometre Array, which you might have heard of. It's a project to build the world's biggest and most powerful radio telescope in South Africa and also in Australia. And this SKA, as we call it, the Square Kilometre Array, the SKA, is fantastic for helping to dispel Afro-pessimism. So this idea that Africa is a continent of lack, that we don't do research or we're not engaged in science. So we've built a precursor telescope to this, and it's the best radio telescope in the world, built by Africans. It's a really fantastic, world-changing telescope, and I'm so proud and privileged to be able to work on it. And, the SKA is learning from, it seems like they're learning from their mistakes when they built this telescope in the Karoo. They asked for and received the blessings from the indigenous owners of the land that we've built this telescope on, which is, for instance, compared to a telescope they're trying to build right now in Hawaii on Mauna Kea. There's a lot of pushback, justifiable as far as I'm concerned, from the indigenous Hawaiian people for whom that mountain that they're trying to build telescopes on is sacred. So we first went and asked for blessings, and there was a lot of photos taken. It was a fantastic photo op with indigenous owners of the land, but that's very surface level. There are a lot of bad things within the organization itself, and ultimately the SKA has inherited the same colonial or oppressive power structures that plague, for instance, the UCT astronomy department and the SAO. So the current situation that we're trying to dismantle or unravel is that the senior academics are almost all white and male, and they have a lot of power concentrated in those few posts. And a large proportion of the senior academics aren't South African even. They are, and the few women that they are not South African either. So that's an issue that they don't, there's this importing of their culture and their academic culture and their just general culture to come to South Africa and impose those kind of standards. Another issue is that the decolonization, or rather transformation work that we're doing in South Africa, I feel is very narrowly focused. It's mostly just race-based, with a little bit of gender binary balance. And this is sort of in contrast to the UK, where up until about maybe a year or two ago, it was all just about gender balance, about getting more women and girls into science. And they made no accommodations for race at all, or class, or anything like that. There's this definite issue of racism and sexual or gender-based harassment in science academia. And students and some junior faculty are very frustrated, and we're trying to change things, but we don't have any buy-in from senior academics. And senior academics are obviously very good at talking the talk, but they have no idea or no intention of, or no incentive to walk the walk, to actually do something concrete to enact lasting and meaningful change. And then the issue also now with the enormous political importance of the square kilometre array in South Africa and globally, the SKA has brought a huge amount of benefits to South Africa and South African science and astronomy in particular. A lot of funding, a lot of global attention, a lot of other resources. It's given us the ability to collaborate with other African countries like Ghana, Kenya, Mauritius, Madagascar, Botswana, Zambia, Namibia. And so this SKA project in South Africa is actually an SKA project in Africa, and it seems amazing. But because it's so politically important, and there's such a lot of, attention on it, it's very, very difficult then to expose and rectify any problems in institutions related to the SKA, because of course, this is our flagship science and technology and innovation project for South Africa and for large parts of our other African partner countries. And so they don't want to be seen to be brought into disrepute. So when you actually put your hand up and say, I'm experiencing racialized harassment, or I'm experiencing gender-based harassment, or don't even try and bring up LGBT issues. I was told we don't do that, we can't do that. It's very difficult because everything, how you say in English, because in Afrikaans we say, hou die blink kant bo. Just keep the shiny side on top and don't worry about the mess that's happening underneath. So I then posited a few ideas of how to move forward. So there's a lot of grassroots efforts, and they struggle to yield results because we don't have buy-in from senior management. And how to encourage this to happen is an open question. So I had some ways forward that I can discuss, but I just want to do a time check. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen very quickly. Or if someone can just tell me how much time I have left.
No, we're still on time, Tana. I'll tell you if we are getting over time.
Yeah, give me like a warning or something, or 2-minute warning. So the first time I gave this talk, I sort of didn't have this idea of how to move forward. The only idea I had was that we need buy-in from senior management, the people who actually have the clout to make sustainable, meaningful, impactful change. They need to come to the party. And since then, I've given this talk a few more times in various guises, and I've thought of some ways forward for individuals. So what can you do as a person in this space? And what can the organizations do? Like what can SKA do, or what can SAO do? Or, physics and astronomy departments at various universities, what can they do? So here's something that was a difficult question that I posited to my colleagues. Why are you in South Africa doing astronomy? And you need to be honest with yourself. Are you here to further your career, possibly at the expense of local academics? Or are you engaging in interventions to support the development of South African astronomy at all? And so this is also to the senior academics that I mentioned earlier who moved here during apartheid. They have to be honest with themselves. And I mean, of course, your answer to this can change over time, but there are certainly people who move to South Africa simply to further their career and have done very little to support Indigenous South African or South African or African scholars, and that's a problem. You can't just come here and make use of our facilities. For instance, in the Northern Cape, they've actually done a study now that shows that we have some of the darkest skies that you can get on Earth without having to actually go into space. So we have these natural resources, now we have these technological resources where you can do world-class, amazing astronomy, and people come here and they use up our resources and they don't give anything back, and that's frustrating. So more ways forward for individuals is, I encourage them to do honest reflection and have honest and difficult conversations about the shortcomings and problems in astronomy academia or in science academia, and what their role is in actually upholding that. And then sort of linked to that, sorry, was that the 5-minute warning?
No, you can continue, Tana.
So a don't that sort of corresponds to that is, don't confess to underrepresented people just to make yourself feel better. You are then adding on emotional labor that isn't needed, because now you're asking for forgiveness and you're saying sorry, and now I have to, absolve you of your past actions, and that's nonsense. I don't need to do that. Please keep those feelings to yourself and work through them on your own. Another do is to go out and educate yourself, because the corresponding don't is, don't burden underrepresented or marginalized people with having to educate you. And in South Africa, this is important and needs to be said, certainly in the African or South African context. Don't be colorblind. This idea of I don't see color is obviously, it's offensive, and it erases an intrinsic and important part of who someone is if you don't acknowledge their race and the implications that that has for them as a person. So for individuals and organizations, I made some suggestions where I said, assume that you are part of the problem and then start trying to fix the problem. And if you don't want to fix the problem, then you need to assess.
You made a mistake when you turned around the fan.
What?
The fan.
Oh.
Mr. Dube, can you please mute yourself?
No,
Mr. Dube, can you please mute yourself?
I'm having flu actually.
Then can you mute him from your side, please? You can continue, Tana.
So so the statement that you assume that you are part of this problem and you need to, and then try to start fixing the problem. So start with yourself and work your way out. And if you don't want to fix the problem, and there are certainly some of my colleagues who are extremely dismissive of this, openly dismissive. There's a lot more of them who are writing private emails and Slack conversations where I think no one will see them, but there are a few that will openly scoff and say, this is like, we just want to do science. We just like, focus on the science. If you do the science, you'll get the recognition, or you'll get ahead in your career or whatever. So if you don't want to fix that problem, then you need to look at your value system and ask yourself, why do you not value certain types of people? Or even just from a very purely sort of cost-benefit analysis type of way to look at it, is what if your value system is making you miss out on good colleagues or students or postdocs that you could have worked with and furthered your research much more efficiently, much more productively, but you are excluding them because of your internalized value system. And then lastly, something to highlight, and I think this will probably resonate with all academics who are listening in, is that we tend to think on timescales of 2 to 5 years because that's our funding timescale. That's usually how long a fellowship lasts, or a grant, or some degree that you're doing. And decolonization timescales are longer than that. And it's a lengthy process, so there's no quick fixes. And I point this out to them, and then I say, but just because it's a lengthy process doesn't mean that it's an excuse or a way to hide the fact that you're not doing anything. So this dismantling, this paradigm shift, this new way of thinking, drawing up policies, getting people on board, it's going to take a long time. But that doesn't mean that you don't start the work. And then ways forward for organizations, this is something that I that I myself am very personally familiar with is this thing about academics from underrepresented or marginalized groups that are asked to do more labor for transformation or decolonization or equity, diversity, and inclusion than those who don't have marginalized identities. And this is called cultural taxation. And I always say to people when I give these talks, I say to my colleagues, you know, I could be writing papers, but instead I have to be on this committee or quickly go be in a photo shoot so it looks like there's Black people at your institution when they really aren't. So instead of writing papers, I'm doing necessary and important work. And so organizations need to acknowledge and compensate for this labor. They can't just expect people to do certain people to do certain kinds of work, unacknowledged and uncompensated, while their more privileged peers just get to write the papers and do the work that actually counts towards furthering their career. This is something that's also very important, and here I chose two very specific people to name here, and this is often a something that's used as a plaster over the problem of transformation and decolonization, where you just have one person in a very senior position and you hope that that's enough to ensure that the workplace culture and values are decolonized. So obvious examples are the Vice Chancellor, Prof. Parking at UCT, and Dr. Rob Adam at SAREO. So SAREO is the South African Radio Astronomical Observatory. So the observatory that runs the Meerkat telescope that I spoke about earlier. And these institutions are still obviously very problematic. There's a lot of problems, despite the fact that Professor Parking is a highly qualified, well-respected Black woman, and Dr. Rob Adam is a scientist, and he's a white man, but he has what I like to call impeccable struggle credentials. So he was a political prisoner for 10 years. And during that time is when he wrote up his chemistry PhD thesis and stuff. So these people are, on paper, it looks like, you know, like Prof. Parking and Rob Adam are, you know, they at the top and they are leading these organizations, that's going to solve all the problems and it's going to trickle down to the grassroots and everything's going to be great, but that's absolutely not what's happening. And what they need to do instead is to start working on sustainable long-term plans of succession that will lead to a more decolonized management structure, more equitable and sustainable management structure, rather than just focusing on the optics of having the right kind of person at the top leading an organization. Another practical thing that I would love to see implemented and that I have advised, not just in South Africa, but also in my capacity as a Royal Society fellowship holder, I was asked to come and give some input along with other African scholars in the UK who are receiving funding on specific Africa-UK joint ventures to fund research. And this is something I said to them, and I've said this to my colleagues, this issue of supervisors not knowing how to supervise. First of all, as academics, we all know we don't get trained on how to be a supervisor or a grant manager or project manager or a lecturer even, but specifically we need to teach supervisors how to supervise in an African or South African context. And this includes raising awareness of how different cultural, religious, linguistic, etc. backgrounds will impact the supervisor-student relationship. And an example of this is you can't come to Africa and not understand our cultures or how to say our names. And as someone who has a slightly strange name, and especially the fact that my surname is a man's first name, when I turn up, people are often surprised because they expect a scientist called Joseph to turn up, and then I turn up. And my name often gets said incorrectly. But when you have an indigenous African name or an African name in an indigenous African language, and you get these Europeans or Australians or whatever the case may be saying your name incorrectly, that is for me one of the biggest forms of disrespect, because you can't even, you fundamentally can't even make the effort to use the right name to identify who I am. And so this is something that's still happening. We still have all these white foreigners just struggling to say Mpo. And it's just like, you know, this is ridiculous. It's 2020. Why do I need to tell you explicitly that this is something that needs to happen? I'm currently now in the process of taking up a fellowship in the Netherlands, and I know that if I were to stay there long term, or if I wanted to become a citizen or a permanent resident of the Netherlands, I actually have to take and pass a course on Dutch. They make you do that as part of their assimilation into Dutch society process. You actually have to write a formalized test and learn Dutch. But no such thing exists in South Africa. Why aren't we encouraging people who come here to want to use our resources and train our students and have so much power and influence over their careers and their research lives? Why are we not imposing similar things and saying, well, you need to learn Xhosa? You're just going to have to suck it up if you want to use our telescopes. You have to, you have to be able to at least speak a little bit. You have to be able to say names properly. You have to understand the context of even religion in South Africa, because a lot of scientists, especially white scientists, think that people who are religious are stupid, that they fundamentally don't understand science, and science and religion are at odds. Whereas in Africa and in South Africa, that is absolutely not true. And a large proportion of South African and African scientists are extremely religious, and they don't find that those two things conflict, but it is something that's very contentious to say outside of Africa. Like, for instance, in the UK, I've had these arguments on social media with people about this issue of, can you be religious and can you be a scientist? And I just look at them and think, you must not know any African scientist if this is the kind of boring conversation that you're trying to have on Twitter. So I think one of the last things I said to organizations is to be transparent in their interventions and practices, and also that they need to be humble and stop being so being so grandiose in their ideas of what their capabilities are, and what they be aware of the boundaries of their knowledge, and that they need to work with people in humanities and social sciences who have extensive experience in decolonial discourse. And the fact that I said decolonial discourse, I said to my colleagues, that sounds super fancy, and I feel like yeah, I don't feel like a scientist now, I feel like a social scientist, because decolonial discourse is not a phrase that gets used at all. Even the word discourse is not a phrase that gets used in the sciences. We don't use words like that. So it's something that I'm really trying to encourage my peers and my colleagues in the sciences to reach out to social scientists, to reach out to those in humanities, like a lot of you listening here, because you have the relevant experience. You have the practice of thinking critically about this, and how to implement this in your institutions, in your lives, etc. And it's not something that scientists have ever been trying to do, and it would be embarrassingly foolhardy if we thought that we can do this without your help. So I think, this is my last thing. This is my hill that I chose to die on. And it's something that I've spoken to politicians about when I've had audiences with them, this issue of paying staff and students on time, because like I said earlier on, especially science academia is predicated on this idea that if you do it, you do science because you love it. And it's vulgar to talk about money, and they just assume that everyone is at least middle class. And what they're doing is they're ignoring the economic reality of South Africa and other African countries, and how that economic reality impacts on our ability to do our research. You can't do world-class research that they're always banging on about if you're worried about rent, if you're worried about your family maybe was far away from you, you have to support on your bursary, and they pay your bursary 3 months late. So this is a very easy, or should be a very easy, straightforward policy or practice to implement. Just make sure you pay people when you say you're going to pay them. But it's something that that's been a struggle in academia in South Africa for decades. So these are the kind of, I think that's my last slide. So now you have an idea of the kind of basic premises that we have to start addressing and that we struggle to grapple with in the sciences. So this is obviously, to you, it probably seems very, like I said, very basic, very introductory stuff, but this is kind of our starting point right now. So we are decades behind social scientists and humanities researchers who grapple with this every day. I have to you have to literally tell people this is decolonization. You should pay people on time because there are, there's class considerations, things that should be obvious and straightforward, but is seen as revolutionary and a bit too much for scientists to want to have to deal with. So I think that's my last slide. Yes, just some references, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. How are we doing for time? Okay.
Time is so good. Thank you very much, Tana, for your presentation. Very insightful. I must say, you're one brave woman, eh? You tell it like it is, which is really good. We need more people like that. I have a few questions for you. One is that, what are your thoughts on the astronomy curricula that you were groomed in? Is there any move to incorporate indigenous knowledge, etc.? And then one point was that when you advocate for more Black people or more for more people to be included, especially those from other races into the sciences, are we not forgetting white women who are not well represented in the sciences, or should we leave them? Maybe you should answer those two questions, and then after I'll give you more questions.
So very relevant and interesting question about the science curriculum. And it's definitely something that we are working towards, including indigenous knowledge systems into our work, because of course these were massively erased and discounted and discredited previously. The most extensive and long-standing tradition of indigenous people with astronomy knowledge, with accurate astronomy knowledge, is the Aboriginal people of Australia and the Torres Strait Islands. So their oral history of astronomy goes back thousands of years, and it can be traced back to thousands of years. And of course, in Southern Africa, we have our own very rich history of indigenous knowledge, not just in astronomy, but in things like, like medicinal botany and all that kind of stuff. And we're now starting to, or there's certain groups now that are starting to try and get this work sort of written down, because a lot of these cultures they have an oral history. So record this for posterity and elevate it to the place where it should be alongside Western science, and to augment Western science, because Western science, of course, is blinkered by, scientists in Europe are blinkered by their own upbringing and their own culture. And so in South Africa specifically, there's this big push right now. We're trying to do, not just in astronomy, but in other sciences as well. For instance, trying to make a science vocabulary in the official languages of South Africa, so in Zulu and Xhosa, and in other South African official languages. So basically trying to build up this, because there's, for instance, one of my colleagues who's also a science communicator was saying that he's Zulu, and when he was starting to do science communication, he realized that, for instance, there's no word in Zulu for fossil. So he had to make up the word fossil. And so we just start little by little, building up like that. I have a Tswana colleague who also does a lot of public radio science outreach. And he was, for instance, stymied by the fact that in Tswana, there wasn't really a clear word to delineate, or phrases to delineate between what is a star and what is a planet, and these kind of fundamental concepts. So we're absolutely attacking this with everything we have. We know this is the crux of where we need to start. We're also trying to we're working on making textbooks reflect our reality. For instance, if you do, or I think this is still the case, if you do an undergraduate degree in astronomy at a South African university, and my white colleagues in Australia also mentioned this as being an issue for them. The textbooks come from the Northern Hemisphere. They come from the US or from Europe. So all the photos that you see of the night sky show the sky upside down compared to our lived experience of what the sky looks like. And the Southern Hemisphere experience of the sky is just as valid as the Northern Hemisphere's, but our textbooks literally don't reflect that. So it's anything from, so words matter, these images matter if we want to really connect our young people with their, our shared heritage of the sky. We're trying to start from basic things like that, but also attacking it from the top. So there's a myriad of efforts like that that are going on right now, trying to get things right already from, like, you know, from when you enter school, you start hearing science being spoken about in your mother tongue, and that's fundamental. And then the second question was, can you just remind me what the second question was again?
It was about creating spaces while we are advocating for more people of color to join the sciences. We must not forget about white women as well, because they have the same struggles. Probably they're asking if you could comment on that.
Okay, so I don't think they have the same struggle as me. No, they don't have the same struggle as a lot of people. They certainly don't have the same struggle as Black women. And there's been studies done in South Africa and in the US that the biggest benefactors or the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action and those kind of policies is white women. So they are taken care of, and they take care of their own as well. And a lot of times when efforts are led by white women, like a lot of feminism, mainstream feminism, it doesn't include that aspect of race or that aspect of class. A lot of advocacy by white women is they assume that you're middle class, and they assume that you are like you don't have other issues. So it's not very intersectional. So yeah, we'll bring the white women along with us. They'll benefit. They've always benefited. I'm not saying it's great. They still also, like, obviously as women, they face gender-based harassment and all of that. But they've done better than the rest of us who have other marginalized identities as well. And they are absolutely included in this. And, you know, we counted them as allies and supporters, but history has also shown that that is not always the case. So, we also then call on white women to kind of disengage from mainstream white feminism and also open up their advocacy to include race or and class and disability and all those other things as well in their work that they are doing.
As well, you mentioned a few prominent people in regards to transformation, and then one of the comments that you made was that how do we trust people that have enslaved us before to drive transformation? And from these prominent people that you have mentioned, like Professor Pakeng, one question was that, isn't it this the beginning? Isn't it the beginning of changing spaces? Because it's something that will take time. Having them there actually means that we begin to change the spaces.
Absolutely, that is a positive way to look at it. But so in the case of UCT, and I know Professor Pakeng has done a lot of work in that regard, and she's like, you know, she's a very busy woman. But in the specific context of astronomy, there's this thing that is seen as, like, you know, Rob Adam is there, and that's good for optics. And when you look at everyone below him in the management structure, it's just so many white foreigners, so many white foreign men. Some of them are sexual harassers, known sexual harassers. They're putting our students and our, like, South Africans and Africans who are already vulnerable for other reasons in danger by, they're literally importing these high-flying white foreign men who they know are sexual harassers, and now they're our problem. Now we have to warn our students. So the work isn't being, once they've kind of chosen someone, the work doesn't filter through. Another example is of this not really being taken too seriously is at SAO, the South African Astronomical Observatory that I said was a little colonial structure that's 200 years old this week. They have never had, in their 200-year history, a South African director of South Africa's oldest research institution. So they're not even there at that stage of figurehead or optics. And in fact, in their last call for, because the director changes every 5 years, in their last call when they were searching for a new director, the NRF, and I guess the government sent down the directive that this time we will be choosing a South African. And who did we choose? A Finnish guy. So, I mean, there's some places that have started, and there's some places that haven't even started. And we know that a lot of times these shortcuts that they try and fob you off by having someone that looks right for the role, that fixes the optics but doesn't fix anything meaningful. So that comment that I made there was directly to places like SAO that haven't even started. And I know when they do start, they're going to have that one person and they're going to say, oh, it's done. We've transformed, we've decolonized, everything's great. We now have a Black director. So I see you, I know you're going to want to do that, but our eyes are on you. So just so that you know, that's like you said, it's the first step. It's only the beginning. And they're not even there yet. After 200 years, we're still waiting.
And when you speak of foreign people, the foreign word, do you include Black people or African Americans or any other Black people from other countries, or it's just foreigners based on the white color?
I mean, a lot of this that I'm talking about is in the African context. So Africans, African Americans certainly, or other the Black diaspora, certainly involved in this. But there's this particular issue of white European, especially, but also North American males who come here and they are problematic and they are in charge and they're so entrenched and they get to do what they want. And I'll give you an example that affected me personally, where the person who is the head of science for the Meerkat telescope, they had a call for proposals. So they opened it up to the community and they said, but only South Africans can apply, because I think it's right that in this case, we prioritize South African researchers. That's part of what we want. But the way they defined who was eligible as a South African was anyone who spends at least half of their research time in South Africa is South African, and anyone who doesn't is not South African. So I happened to be abroad on a Fulbright fellowship at the time. And so I was deemed not South African. So I couldn't apply for time on a South African built telescope in South Africa because this Portuguese man decided that I wasn't South African. But all of the Europeans and Americans, Canadians, they were allowed to apply because they moved to Cape Town 2 years ago and that's where they work now. So they're all South African. So these are the kind of political decisions that are made. And on paper, it looks like this man is trying to prioritize and help South Africans, but in practice, he actually disenfranchised me and several other Black women who happened to be studying abroad at the time. We were all locked out. We weren't allowed to be principal investigators in this work, despite the fact that they'd been grooming us to take up these positions. When it actually comes down to practicalities, they then exclude us. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to avoid, that you need to have someone who understands these concepts and makes things actually inclusive, because that was a stupid way to define South African. They didn't repeat it because of the backlash, but the fact that it was enacted in the first place is utterly ridiculous.
And one comment is that we often hear that in Africa, we don't have the skills. We don't have, especially in the sciences and the STEM field, we don't have the skills. And most of the people that give us the skills, the funding for those skills are international funding. If we challenge this, are we not letting ourselves not get this funding? Are we not disadvantaging ourselves when it comes to skills and all that?
So that's also a very good question. Of course, when funding drives everything, money makes the world go round. And so this is why, like I said before, I've, for instance, spoken or been asked to give support and advice on policy on how, for instance, the UK can make their Africa-UK research funding channels more equitable and more in line with social justice ideals. So when I also say, I give these talks, not just in South Africa, but in Europe so far as well, and in the US, because to kind of let them know that while we value their input, they also need to get their house in order. So, and there is also a push from, for instance, our colleagues in the US are doing a lot of this kind of work in science and STEM academia, and it's slowly picking up here in Europe as well. So, and it's starting to put pressure on these funding bodies who would give us our funding so that we can do our research, this funding that's so desperately needed. And so they are taking care of their own communities as well. So this idea of so I don't think we need to be too worried about them cutting off our funding if we try and make it, by Africans for Africans kind of thing. I think they're still very willing to support us. And I think it's almost a case of, it's still the hangover of, the white savior. So they want to give Africa money because Africa needs money because they have nothing and they're so poor and underdeveloped. And so that will never go away, but it needs to be done in a way that is actually sustainable, meaningful, and beneficial to the recipients of that money.
To a large extent, we need to start changing how people view Africa, because we are very capable. Absolutely. And I think this is the last question. They're saying, how can we foster collaborations between the sciences and other fields, the humanities, and because we don't see many of these relationships.
I'm so glad you brought that up because that was something that I was going to bring up myself. And this is why I'm so happy to be here today, because like I said, I tell my colleagues outright, reach out to the humanities, reach out to the social sciences who have this expertise. We can't do everything by ourselves. And I don't know if they are ready yet to make that step, but I would like to come forward and hold my hand up and say, be used as a contact person or whatever to be able to foster these interdisciplinary research ideas or work, or just like, a workshop or something, because we desperately need it. And I am happy to be a torchbearer and take this news back. So if anyone wants to work with us, please do get in touch. I have the ear of some and it won't last forever, so we must strike while the iron is hot. I have the ear right now of a senior NRF official and some senior people as well, because as you can imagine, these talks, like I said, have garnered a lot of interest, and so there's a lot of spotlight on me right now, and we might as well use that for good. So if you have an idea or something we can work on or anything like that, please do get in touch. There are a few of us who are very interested to hear from all of you and respect what you are doing, and would really appreciate the help and support and guidance that you can give.
Certainly encourage collaborations. I'm sure most of our colleagues here, they've had you. We have a context and we are able to share them. I think we've come to the end of our seminar, our webinar, And Tana, from my side, we don't meet a lot of Black women in high positions. You're the first Black astronomer that I know. And I'm highly encouraged because then, it speaks it speaks volume that, well, we're getting things into the right direction. Continue doing the work that you do. And remember, when you do it, build other Black women so that we have Black successful women. We are tired of when we hear about Black women, we hear abuse, we hear rape and all those things. We need Black women in higher positions. And from myself and others from CCS, obviously I'll hand over to Shauna. Thank you very much. Bye, Dangi.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity. And I look forward to speaking more with you and interacting more with this community in future.
Thanks so much, Andres. Thanks, Tana. That was really, really amazing. I think I just want to highlight two things that I think you brought up. The first was moving beyond the optics, because I think there have been quite a few places that have reached pretty good optics. That word optics, everything looks okay on the top, but actually underneath that metaphor that you used. And the second thing is working in silos, because I do think there seems to be quite distinct ways that people understand decolonization. Does it, what does it mean if you are in a university environment and you have a group of lecturers who have one view of what decolonization means, and then students who are on the receiving end of the teaching and learning and have a different view of what decolonization means? How, and then you have a university bureaucracy that in a way blocks anything that you're trying to do, because within its own processes and ways of working, it is so colonized that it's difficult for you to move through that. So how, and how can the disciplines come together to work through that instead of people working in their silos? So I think that for me has been the main takeaways, and also please keep up your radical traditions in the sciences and rocking all the boats that you are rocking and asking the questions and forcing others to ask questions. Thanks so much for this, and thanks to everyone for participating. Please keep an eye out for our upcoming seminars. We've also got Sajida Seda, who's going to be doing a seminar a bit later on, a webinar a bit later on, and she's going to be focusing on decolonizing the humanities. But in between, we have some very interesting speakers and various themes on decolonizing. So please join us. And in the meantime, until we see you again, please keep safe. And Andries and Dan, please stick around a bit. Tana, keep safe, especially since you seem to be in a high alert environment with all those locked up students who are no doubt partying amongst themselves regardless.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Shauna, and thank you to the audience for listening. Yeah, and like I said, I look forward to carrying on this conversation on other platforms. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.